going to bed ritual last night, sort of raging at my own incompetence. You've probably been there yourselves, but
more than I'd like to admit.
More than you'd like to admit, yeah. Technology does that. I guess my precious was taken away from me, so yeah. So we've been looking at the. We looked at evil for a great deal of time in numerous aspects of it, and we were looking at the antidote to that as Tolkien portrays it, because the portrait of evil is compelling and persuasive, I think, insofar as it talks about the complexity. But that's not really why people read the book. It's the portrait of the good that draws people and compels them. And I just had to submit a proposal for a conference paper out in Vancouver, and it's going to be based on what I'm doing in this course. And that's what I tried to argue, is that Orwell and Huxley are talking about the same social landscape, the same myth of progress gone wrong, the same dystopia, the same tyranny over human nature enacted by those who are in power and authority. But those books, which are read in schools as instruction manuals to acquaint people with what's going on, don't present any hope or any goodness in them at all, as far as I can tell. They're very bleak novels, which are born of the experiences of those who fought the First World War, I think, and the Second World War, for that matter. So the 20th century is a very bleak century, there's no doubt about it, and a great deal of despair, which gave way eventually to the sexual revolution, which is, again, a sort of desperation. Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. Or fornicate in the case of the sexual revolution. But this total lack or loss of sense of hope and belief in human goodness, which is characteristic of 20th century fiction, which is why I don't like it, by and large. And some of it not only talks about it, some of it delights in it. That's a further perversion. But these books by our two Oxford scholars, Lewis and Tolkien, present a view of the goodness of life while never minimizing the depravity and evil that the other authors catalog. And so that's what we're looking at here, is exactly the way in which Tolkien does so, and I wanted to structure it in accordance with the 4 cardinal virtues I said last time. It's the method for Ralph Wood in his The Gospel According to Tolkien. I think it's helpful and effective. He's not the only one that uses this. It's certainly one that Tolkien, we would expect, would use, because he's a Catholic. And if you think about it, if you've read any of Dante, you will know that in Purgatory, we have the 7 deadly sins being purged, and the virtues that accord to it are prudence and justice and temperance. And what's the other one? Fortitude. Thank you. And these are the antidote to the 7 deadly sins, are the 7 virtues. Now, there are 4 cardinal virtues that is, are common to the ancient world, the pagan world, and the Christian world, although they get transformed, and I'll talk about that. And then there are the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, about which the ancient world knows nothing, and for which reason Virgil can't take Dante any further up Mount Purgatory than he does. But it's interesting that Virgil does take Dante up Mount Purgatory, because he understands the virtues, at least the 4 cardinal virtues. You would think, what's he doing in purgatory? Because no non-Christian should be in purgatory. He hasn't believed in Christ, so he's not being purged of his sins. But it's because of his understanding of the cardinal virtues that he is there. So you expect that in Tolkien. You don't expect it in Lewis. necessarily as a Protestant. And yet when you read Mere Christianity, he talks about precisely that. He begins by discussing natural law, or the Tao. And then he goes on later on in the book, when he's talking about Christian ethics, to talk about the cardinal virtues. And so I think it's there in both men's work. And so that is what is distinctively attractive about Tolkien and Lewis's works, neither of which really present Christian theology explicitly. Remember, we've said Tolkien and Lewis both deny that they are even presenting their works as allegories of the Christian faith, although we had issues with their objection. We said we don't take them seriously. I think that's rather arrogant of us. Maybe they mean it in a way that we don't understand. In fact, they do mean it in a way we don't understand immediately. But they do nonetheless present a real and substantive rejoinder to the problems of the 20th century. And so what they present, and this is what my conference paper will say, which is in my mind, they don't present a theological response to their century. They present an anthropological response based on the goodness of the created order and the goodness of the rational creatures that live in it. And so they present it in terms of the four cardinal virtues, but these four cardinal virtues, as we have seen, are transformed by Christian thought. And so last time we looked at how prudence is, and he says, Ralph Wood says that prudence is very similar to wisdom, exercises itself in a sort of holy folly. That's wisdom. There's a folly, so it's not, remember, the world's wisdom is foolishness to the Greeks, and yet it is the wisdom of God. That is presented in The Lord of the Rings. So there is a sort of wisdom, and it's a wisdom in a folly, the folly that the company itself undertakes when it goes to destroy the Ring of Power. That's a sort of a wisdom, and yet there is certainly a folly in it. We'll come to that. Justice is also presented in Christian terms in an undeserved mercy. I'll talk about that right now. But the other two virtues are courage. Courage is presented not only in terms of remaining or mastering one's fears in the face of a formidable enemy, but actually more so in long suffering, patience, endurance, part of the pilgrimage of life. It's a Christian understanding of courage, which the Apostle Paul talks about. And finally, temperance is a sort of a joyful self-denial. So, whereas classical temperance is a moderation. You know, you don't go to either extreme. You're temperate. So it's not, as I said the last time we talked about temperance, I said it in evangelical culture, temperance tends to mean teetotalism. We don't drink, but that would not be the classical or even the normal understanding of temperance for Christians. Christians would say that we drink, but not to excess. That would certainly be Lewis and Tolkien's view. So we do indulge, but not to excess, and we also don't avoid it altogether, because there's joy in it, and the joy is to be received as joy. But now it's not. But in Tolkien's rendering, the temperance isn't in moderation, it's actually in putting oneself second. There's a sort of a self-denial that's in it. So these are all transformed cardinal virtues, and very Christian in their understanding and even in their demonstration in the course of this novel, or this trilogy, even while it's cast back 6,000 years. So it's a pre-Christian era, without a doubt. So we looked at wisdom and prudence last time, and self-sacrifice, and I think we talked about going to the Black Gate, and the sense of not despair in doing that, but of hope, actually. Hope, the folly of going to confront Sauron when his army is far greater, and they know that they can't defeat him militarily. Nonetheless, they go out there not to just die in a crazy fashion, but to draw his eye in the hope that Frodo and Sam might succeed in their quest. So let's talk about justice here, and the portrait of justice, and see it in the way that Tolkien presents it as a Christian. Justice is, in its historic Christian sense, rendering each his due. Rendering each person his due. That's what justice is. God is, of course, not only the preeminently just being in the world, so give him what he's due, we ought to praise him and act in accordance with his commands. That's just justice to do so. But also he demands that we treat other people justly, appropriately, and that has positive and negative connotations. So positively, we're to love our neighbor. They deserve that. It's just to do it. It's not that we're doing something to them that they don't deserve. They deserve our love, actually. Although God commands us to do something that they actually deserve, because we don't do it, because we're sinners. But we're commanded to love one another. Note that it is a command. So it's something that's deserved. It's just. We're to love the Lord our God. That's the greatest commandment, with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's doing a just thing. And it can be seen negatively, on the other hand, when we do something that is sinful, it is punished in accordance with the gravity of the sin committed. So the punishment for first-degree murder is a life for life. It's there in Genesis 9. It's not more than that. You don't kill the family, you don't kill the village, you don't wipe them out, you don't erase their memory from all of, but there is a life, and that is because the value you place on that life is another life, and there's no other just measure of that. In the Humanitarian theory of punishment, Lewis's little essay, that's what he talks about. That's what we mean by justice. Whereas the Humanitarian theory of punishment is to throw people in prison forever, which does not actually solve the problem justly. He says if we don't actually have a just measure of the offense and a just punishment for the offense, we're never sure that justice is done. Justice becomes an entirely arbitrary thing. Furthermore, when somebody comes out of prison, we have the sense that this person is a criminal, not somebody who's done his time or has served his punishment and now is a free person. So nobody's ever free. We always have to be supervised. And so he said, instead of people being punished as criminals and then acting like other members of the human community, we treat the whole world as a jail. So we supervise everyone, including that person. So they're never free. So it's a very interesting essay, by the way. Very, very interesting. Whatever you might make of it, it is actually probably a traditional defense of the justice of the penal justice system. On the other hand, that does not preclude mercy. We'll come to that, because actually, in order to be just, mercy is required. I will talk about that in a second as well. But in the biblical sense, justice is a sense of God's justice or his doom. There's a doomsday book in the English language, an old book of how God ultimately will, as judge, come to judge the world. And justice is there throughout the ancient world. So again, referring back to Dante's Purgatorio, the one that Dante meets when he first comes up to Mount Purgatory is Cato, the lawgiver of Rome, the most severe judge of the ancient world, renowned for his justice. Very highly prized in the Roman world, law and order. Similarly, the Scandinavian and Germanic cultures were renowned for their strong sense of justice. So every sin by that mark is an injustice, by the way. When you don't render things their due, God or our neighbors, that's called a sin. It's fundamentally an injustice to sin. So in Leviticus 25, 35 and 36, we read, "If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall maintain him. As a stranger and sojourner he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or increase, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you." And that's just one statement on it. But there's an element of charity and mercy that is a part of being just. It's also in Paul's letters, it says that the man who does not work should not eat. So there's a requirement as well, for the sake of justice, that people who are able to labor should labor. That's also justice. So it's rendering those that other people their due, but it's also giving even aliens and strangers their due, treating them well. And one of the reasons that the Hobbits live in such a delightful world is that they are hospitable. They delighted in parties, they delighted in presents, they give them away freely, and they eagerly accept them. This is a just world. So the Shire is presented almost as an Edenic place in which justice is done. We don't even get the sense of real wrongdoings. It's just sort of petty, small, envious things, which are, of course, the root of sin. But nonetheless, they're not full-blown manifestations of it. There seems to be a really joyful existence in the Shire, which is part of the problem. But hospitality is definitely demonstrated there. Now, the Hobbits' problem, what is the Hobbits' chief problem, actually, in the Shire? What is their chief problem? If they have one. That's the problem. They don't have any problems. They're complacent. They don't say they're complacent, and their guard is down. They're a bit like Canadians. They regard themselves as non-offensive. They take delight in their physical pleasures. They're warm towards others. They see themselves as hospitable, inclusive, all those things. But they are not vigilant about the possibility of evil, and in fact, to some degree, they don't even see themselves as capable of doing it. It's shocking when it rears its ugly head in their midst. And so there's an inward complacency, and the natural inclination of all sinful fallen beings towards entropy or self-destruction is there. So I'll read it from. So again, like Canadians, they're actually the beneficiaries of the wars of others and the great powers. In the Canadians' case, the great power to our south. So not only do we benefit from the Americans' vigilance on the world stage, we rebuke the Americans for being warlike, whereas we're pacifists, we're morally superior, more inclusive, etc., etc. So this is Tolkien's comment. They're in that pleasant corner of the world. They plied their well-ordered business of living, and they needed less and less the world outside where dark things moved. They heeded less, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians and the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. Now note that they're not yet ungrateful, they're just ignorant. Though there will be the commentary by Lewis, certainly, that those who live in a state where everything's provided, like in a socialist state, they invariably receive something, everything as something they're entitled to, and thereby become ingrateful, which is an enormous sin. So they live a life of ease. Now, this doesn't ruin them. The corruption is not set in, but it renders them unwilling to engage with the world around them in its sinfulness. And interestingly, however, this sort of they become very important in the great quest of destroying the ring. So it comes to Frodo, as it turns out, and Frodo is shocked at this, doesn't want to leave the Shire. Again, he's in some ways a typical hobbit, loves the Shire, loves everything about it, and has no desire to leave it whatsoever. While he's delighted in the stories of Bilbo, the rest of the hobbits regard Bilbo with some suspicion, because again, he breaks up he causes them discomfort, suggests that there are grand quests abroad and so forth, and they might actually have to think about life outside of the Shire. So when they come, when the threat comes to the Shire, they're not prepared for it at all, not in the least. It's a shock to them. And then when the ring does come to Frodo, Frodo says that I'm not made for such perilous quest. Why has it come to me? And Gandalf says, can't answer your question. Such questions cannot be answered, but you may be sure that it was not because of any merit that others don't possess. There's nothing particularly good about you. And what's interesting is Gandalf does not connect it to precisely that point, that he lacks merit in his own eyes. That there's a humility that actually allows him to be resistant to the power of the ring. Right? Because he doesn't think of himself as a grand figure, capable of doing grand things, even resisting Sauron. So that sense of smallness in his own eyes helps him resist the coercive power of the ring and the seductive power of the ring. Now, one thing that the ring does do is that there's a relationship between justice and greed, because one of the things that we notice that is characteristic of the hobbits is that they're greedy, just like the elves, and just like the dwarves, who delve too deeply in the earth. And the elves delighted too much in their own beauty. And the men delighted too much in their martial prowess. And there was a greed that came with it. And Shelob, the spider, delighted not in power, but more in life. She wanted to take life from others and gorge upon it and live eternally. There was a sort of a greed there. Now, greed is also a form of injustice. It's a desire for things beyond any moderation, and desire for things that don't belong to you. Desire for other people's things. So the Shire is not threatened. Eventually the Shire is threatened from without by Sauron. That's how the story begins. But the greater threat is within the Shire, within the greed of the hobbits. Remember, greed is a very primary form of injustice. It's the lust for good, your own good, at the expense of others. That's what greed is. You can present in various forms. Gluttony, the envy of others' wealth, the desire for the hoarding of great wealth. Well, that's the desire of the dragons. It's a sort of a greed. In the case of Gollum, he wants to eat fish. He wants to gorge himself on fish. That's his greed. That's all it does. That's how pathetic a creature is. And in the end, it consumes him. And so the scriptural understanding that the love of money is the root of all evils, of all kinds of evils rather, is deeply rooted in the sinfulness of the creatures of all Middle Earth. So there's a desire for more than one deserves. And that's a form of injustice. And I'm going to use a little neat phrase by Wood, that Wood uses here because I think it's quite helpful. He says that truth is the first casualty not only of war, but also of greed. So Sauron is so greedy for the power of the ring that his mind and will have been bent totally out of shape by it. And so greed will allow people to rationalize their actions and twist the truth. And so when Gandalf is asking about the history of the ring, he seemed to think that the truth was important, because he realized that the distortions of it and the effect of the ring is to wish to distort the truth for the purposes of rationalizing one's greed and to excuse the evil of it. Both Gollum was culpable of this, and so was Bilbo, for that matter. Right, so he started distorting how he came by the ring and his and how much it belonged to him. And we see it also with Sauron, when he no longer wishes to be Sauron the White, but Sauron the many-colored. There's an eagerness, a desire to have more than he's been given, a dissatisfaction with life. And so this is a great illustration. When Saruman is given mercy by Gandalf at the end of the Two Towers, when Orthanc has been destroyed, and Gandalf tells him to come down, and you'll let him go. Just let him go. He'll show him mercy. Saruman is enraged by the prospect, because he asks him that he says that he will return his staff and the key to the fortress of Barad-dûr later on. Give them to me and I will give them to you later. But first you have to renounce your power and your greed. And his response is this. Saruman's face grew livid, twisted with rage, and a red light kindled in his eyes. He laughed wildly. Later, he cried, and his voice rose to a scream. Later! Yes, when you have the keys of Barad-dûr itself, I suppose, and the crowns of 7 kings, and the rods of the 5 wizards, and have purchased yourself a pair of boots many sizes larger than those that you wear now. A modest plan, hardly one in which my help is needed. I have other things to do. Do not be a fool. If you wish to treat with me while you have a chance, go away and come back when you are sober, and leave behind these cutthroats and small ragtag that dangle at your tail. So he receives this as just, he can't receive the mercy of it. He sees it as just greed on Gandalf's part, and Gandalf is lying. Why? Because that's what he does. So characteristically, figures who have given in to greed and not repented of it impute the same motive in others. They can't receive grace and mercy as such. They always see it as some form of trick. And in the end, he prefers to be miserable. So he rejects the mercy that he's given. There's another form of justice, and it is in the form of war. We have to talk about this. Because wars are fought, and they were fought in the wars, the First World War, because of it, one, out of a sense of greed, but also a sense of justice. Remember what I said, the myth of progress connected with social Darwinism was that each of the European powers they believed that they had the technological and scientific advances that they did, and it demonstrated that it was just for them to become more powerful. That's how they rationalized it. It's just that the British should rule the world. It's just that the Germans should rule the world. It's just that they all saw this, as an expression of their own worth. And so they were just getting what they were due. So they thought. And therefore war was justified because it was just. This was just war. Because they saw a divide, a creaturely divide between themselves, whatever nation they belonged to, and the other nations. So it's right that the Germans should conquer the rest of Europe, because we are, after all, the most culturally advanced of all, scientifically, theologically, culturally, the music in Germany, etc. I just talked about the way the inner allurement of greed is a form of seduction. We desire things that aren't ours. So that's an internal coercion or internal lure, whereas war is an external coercion. And what's interesting in the two cases is that combating the internal form of allure of the ring is not the same as combating the external power of the ring. So you can't defeat the internal coercion of the ring or seduction of the ring by physical force. It's not possible. But you have to combat the external powers of the ring through physical force. So it's a very different path. And Tolkien makes it clear that if the free peoples of Middle-earth do not ally themselves and fight a physical fight against the coercive power of Sauron, they will be defeated. It's necessary for them to do so. At the same time, the problem isn't merely physical coercive power, there's an internal corruption. So even if you do that, you can't, even if you fight a war, you're not going to destroy the problem of evil. But you are going to destroy, or at least resist, one manifestation of it, which will destroy you. Tolkien is quite clear, and Lewis is the same, that they both think that there is such a thing as just war, and that it is necessary to fight it furthermore, and that it's unjust not to fight it in the instance that it is a just war. By the way, a just war is not the greater glory of Britain or the greater glory of Germany. That's not a just war. It's battling an evil that threatens to overcome the good. So it's resisting evil, coercive regimes. Not for self-aggrandizement, but to defend what is good and just and true and beautiful. That's a just war. And there's also a justice even in the battling of evil, which is that you cannot use means that are more powerful than that which you resist. So if they bring a knife to the gunfight, you don't. They bring a knife to the fight, you don't produce a gun. Or if you do, you lay it down immediately. You've done the fight, but the aim is not to destroy your enemy. And that was the problem in both world wars, is that the armies of Europe were actually fighting civilians. It was total war. There was nobody who was not involved in the war. This itself was a manifestation of how unjust the war was. Even non-combatants, even women and children were being drawn into it. They were being bombed for the sake of spreading terror. But it had to be fought. But note that, and so Tolkien recommends this repeatedly. He presents the figures of, what's his name, Gimli and, what's his name? The elf. Legolas. They're sitting there counting how many fit. So this is traditional heroism. 42, 43. Oh, got one. Pull it. He was already dead. No, he wasn't. He was twitching still. Whatever. Okay. So this is traditional heroism in some ways. Aragorn marshalling the troops and standing on the wall. This is traditional heroism, fighting evil. When Theoden emerges and rides out to combat, this is traditional heroism, martial prowess in battle. And there's a great deal of Tolkien is unabashed in praising the desire of them to kill their enemies. He doesn't diminish it in any way. When evil is assaulting you, it is right and a right emotion to feel that in the destruction of your enemies. You ought to feel some sort of reward for that. But he's also very wary of this because the problem with an unjust war or with an immoderate fighting of the war is that you give in to another kind of evil, which is the evil within yourself. And that's a worse evil. Because who's going to restrain that? Somebody else may restrain you externally. Who's going to restrain you internally? So this is the problem with unjust wars, is that it corrupts those that are fighting them. So I would say terrorism chiefly destroys not the people being terrorized, but the terrorists themselves. It destroys their humanity. It leads them to despair. It's the product of a lust for power, which is all-consuming. It consumes the terrorists and the cultures that promote terrorism. And I'm not just talking about Islam in our day. I'm also talking about the use of torture and means of terror that their opponents will also use. So think about drone warfare, shooting, terror from the skies. You haven't even seen the enemy that comes. This seems to me to be a sort of terrorism, which actually undermines the moral integrity of the people using the technological means. Anyway, and that, well, at least that's how Tolkien seems to present it. A good illustration of the just man who combines justice and mercy is Faramir. Yeah. He again, one of the things I most hate about the movies is the portrait of Faramir, because he's such a good character in the novel, and he's such a weak, sniveling character in the movie. But he is presented as the brother of brave Boromir, and he's equally brave. There's no less bravery in Faramir. His father, Denethor, prefers Boromir, not because he's braver, but because he is more like him. And he does not show mercy to his enemies. He wants to win at all costs. This is a reflection of Denethor's injustice. And Faramir is willing to die, but he's going to do so. The reason for doing so is not to defeat his enemy, but defend the good. And that's key. It's not to win valor on the battlefield. It is to defend what lies behind him. It's not because he hates what's in front of him, it's because he loves what's behind him. Key. So he takes no pleasure, which the ancient world would, in the grandeur of mortal combat. That was lauded in the ancient world. Tolkien and Lewis have thrown that off entirely because they've seen 2 world wars in which people are slaughtering one another indiscriminately in the most degrading fashion imaginable, dying in the muck, dying by inhaling some sort of gas, dying of fevers and trench foot and so forth, and gangrene, and just a horrible means of death. Fighting in mortal combat for 4 years and the battle lines don't move. This is not a valorous form of battle. So they don't see the glory in war at all. It's no longer there. Nonetheless, there is the purpose of the war they will support because it resists an evil which is far worse. So these men need to be praised for their willingness to sacrifice themselves, but there's no joy in it for the men anymore. It's a necessary evil. So Faramir is a good illustration of this. He takes no pleasure in war. He sanctions it for defensive, non-retaliatory purposes. So I'll read a quotation. "For myself," said Faramir, "I would see the white tree," the symbol of thriving Gondor, "in flower again in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown return, and Minas Tirith in peace. Minas Anor again, as of old, full of light, high and fair, beautiful as a queen amongst other queens, not a mistress of many slaves, nay, not even a kind mistress of willing slaves. War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, the city of the men of Numenor, and I would have her loved for her memory, her ancientry, her beauty, and her present wisdom. Nor feared, save as men may fear the dignity of a man old and wise."
Amen.
Yeah, he delights in the beauty and the goodness and the wisdom that the city represents, and he wants to preserve that. That's what I think we do in the humanities, by the way. There's a sort of a war against the sense of futility of life. That's what drew me to study what I study, and the authors that I do, is really it's promoting what is good and spreading it. Because again, you can fight fights because you hate your enemy. That's a bad reason. Or you can understand what the good is and you cherish it, and that will restrain you even in your fighting that, and will help you understand the dignity of your opponents. By the way, this speech from Faramir, you could never find this in any of the Norse epics that Tolkien so loved. And you won't find it in the Greeks and the Romans either. That sort of sentiment. It's a Christian sentiment. But note that there's no reference to God. There's a reference to the fundamental goodness of the created order as they have received it, and the wisdom. And note that he lauds a piety as well. There's ancestral piety. There's the love not only of himself and his neighbors, but of those neighbors who gave him birth, his ancestors, his predecessors, which is expressed by trying to remember the best that they did and said. So, and at the end of The Lord of the Rings, another figure who's now grown wise is Frodo. Frodo, at the end of having destroyed the Ring of Power, or having brought it to the cracks of Mount Doom and then not destroyed it, but it is destroyed, he will no longer wield a blade at all. He refuses all violence. Is Tolkien recommending pacifism? I don't see how you could hold that view, because he doesn't even tell those that are under his authority that they should drop their blades. He's just saying he won't do it. And he asks them, or he commands them to slay no hobbits if they can help it. So here's the quotation. "There is no slaying of hobbits, not even if they've gone over to the other side. No hobbit has ever been killed," he points out, "has ever killed another on purpose in the Shire, and it is not to begin now, and nobody is to be killed at all if it can be helped. Keep your tempers and hold your hands to the last possible moment." But note that they've got weapons. They've got arrows and they have swords. He himself doesn't, but they do. But he wants them to restrain themselves. He recognizes the necessity of war, but he himself will not do the violence himself. Now, why is that? Perhaps because of the coercive or the corrosive power of the ring on him, the way it's harmed him. He can't use violence anymore. And remember, violence is a form of injustice. Whenever you use violence, so for example, in the Bible, David slays his enemies. Is David not the Lord's anointed? Yes, he is. Does he not go into battle against the Philistines and others to defend Israel? Yes, he does. Is it just that he does it? Yes, it is. Will God allow him to build a temple for him? No, he won't. Why not? Because he's a man of blood. He's killed. It's just war, but you've still killed. You're a man of blood. You cannot construct the temple. That will be for your son to do. So even though it's a just war that he would fight, it's not wrong that he does it. There's an understanding that there's an element of sin involved even in just wars. And it does corrupt those that commit it. So Frodo has been involved in carrying the ring, and it's had a harmful effect on him. In the end, he has to eschew violence. That's just for him. But let's look at the balance of justice and mercy. This is really important. And we will say that mercy or grace is greater than justice. And nonetheless, the two are in balance. So let me present it this way. How is justice portrayed in terms of pictorial presentation? Have you ever seen justice portrayed? It's in the courts. Historically, justice is portrayed in a statuesque form. How is justice portrayed? You probably know this. There are scales in the one in the hand. That's correct. So that's weights and measures. A sword in the other. Correct. And blindfolded. That's key. So justice is blind, and there's an equity. So the scales and measures, the punishment will be equal to the crime committed. That's there. And there's an impartiality about the justice. It's not the justice of the powerful and the rich. And yet there will be sword, there will be vengeance. That's part of whatever the scales say, there will be justice. So justice is presenting as giving people their due. As I say, that's what justice is, rendering each person his due. And God, of course, as I say, is the ultimately just figure, and he is also the one who has the greatest injustice done to him. That sin is the greatest injustice of all, and it's committed against God, chiefly. But rendering to each his due is justice. How about mercy? Mercy is people not getting what they deserve. That's the definition of mercy. You deserve this, I'm going to show mercy to you. So how do we resolve the contradiction between the biblical demand for justice and the biblical demand for mercy? Because it's a contradiction. How is it even possible? This is Wood's point, and it's bang on. The answer is in relation to how all creatures relate to God. How do we relate to God? We are given life as a gift. It is an unmerited favor. There's goodness, and it's given. He causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, it says in Scripture. On the righteous and the unrighteous. Right? They all receive good things. Theologians will call it common grace. So that's the fundamental action of God, is to show grace and mercy. It's a miraculous gift. There's nothing we can do to repay it. It can't be recompensed. Or the just recompense for grace is praise. Right? We praise God and rejoice in him because we understand our lives are a gift. The ancient world acknowledges it. They worship the gods as well. So do Christians. The only people who don't are post-Christian, anti-grace contemporaries. You don't give praise to anything other than their football teams or their hockey teams, whatever their idols are. But he says, Wood says, God does not owe us our existence, but grants it as a sheer miraculous gift. There's nothing we can do to compensate for it. And to make it something deserved, or there's nothing we can do to make it something deserved, and we can't return the gift either. To give God his gift back is to show ingratitude for the gift. You have to receive the gift. And sin magnifies the obligation. So now not only do we receive the gift of life, we have, because of sin, we act as gods. Remember, the original sin is that if you eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall be as gods, determining both good and evil. So we take God's place. So now what we owe God is far greater. And in response to our rejection of common grace, he sends us his son. More grace. Now it's grace to not to just undeserving beings, but to unjust beings. So we've rejected his grace, demanded that we be God and not he. So to understand God's character is, yes, to understand him as just, but more than just, he is gracious. That's his primary character, or the way the Anglicans put it, his chief property is mercy. Chief property. He is a merciful God. That defines his character. How do we see that? Go to the Beatitudes. Look at the portrait of the life of the Christian that Jesus presents. You've heard it said, but I say to you. And blessed is the man, and so forth. Go through the Beatitudes. This is a description of a life of understood as a life of grace. And that will be doing justice. So justice grace underpins justice. This is how we're to act. We're to act in a gracious fashion. Not in the future, but now. That's when we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're to enact a merciful, a gracious world right now. Showing mercy to our enemies. Loving our enemies. Turning our cheek to those that would wrong us. Right? Christ himself is the example of this. So he demonstrates that mercy isn't, Tolkien demonstrates that mercy is not contrary to justice, it is the true realization of justice. Because God is gracious, and he graciously creates all things, and so they should respond graciously. Even to injustice. The best response to injustice is to respond with mercy and grace. How does he demonstrate this? Let's look at a few illustrations. I don't think we think of it this way because we think of it in such heroic terms. There are two monstrous injustices, which they don't seem very monstrous, as I say. But Éowyn is charged, we saw this last time, with staying behind and looking after the women and children, while the men go to combat. She hates this. She wants to die because she's committed, she's desperate. She thinks that they're going to fail and she wants to go down with them. She can wield a blade and she is valorous. There's no doubt about that. But she has been ordered to remain behind as the steward of, not Gondor, what's the other? Rohan. Stay behind. And she doesn't. She disobeys. She rides out in disguise. This is a monstrous injustice. And she's the head. And what has she done? She's abandoned the women and children. She's left her post. This is a monstrous act. I don't think we don't see it that way because we know what she's going to do, or we say, this is wonderful. But actually it's a monstrous act. She's just left those that are defenseless without defense. She was it. She's been given a charge and she's abandoned her duty. Left her post. Terrible injustice. Same thing. King Theoden also ordered Mary to stay behind. He rides out with her. Right? And then, of course, we know the outcome. Éowyn helps win the Battle of Pelennor Fields by slaying the Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul. And Mary helps him with that, stabs him in the foot. And both of them are stricken for this, right? Because they confront evil and the evil sort of consumes them. They're dreadfully damaged by this. What is the response of Theoden to this disloyalty and this abandonment? So there's the rejection of his orders and the abandonment of their post. How does he treat them? It should be a death sentence, by the way. In a military, they would be executed for that, I can tell you. You were given a direct order, and you not only were given a direct order in the case of Eowyn, you were the commanding officer. You left your post. You got lucky. Yeah, you did this. This is great, but you still abandoned your post. What sort of military discipline would be if everyone did what was right in their own eyes and did what they wanted to do? There would be no discipline at all, and there could be no good that was done. It would destroy all morale, furthermore. What does Theoden do? He forgives her. And Mary. Mercy. As a fulfillment of a sort of justice. Or as a demonstration as a sort of justice. Not an acknowledgement that they did the right thing. That's not what it is. He shows them mercy. He didn't say, oh, you were right and I was wrong. That is never said. He's merciful. To a lesser extent, we can see it with Pippin and Gandalf. He's told not to take the Palantir. He goes and gets it, and looks at it anyway, and he's spared from it. In the end, Gandalf forgives him for it. But he could have just... think about what he's just done. He's looked into the Palantir, and now he sees a little hobbit, and of course he can... If Sauron breaks his mind, all of their plans are in ruins. Frodo and Sam will be betrayed to Sauron, and it's all over. This is monstrous treachery on Pippin's part, right? Just because he's curious. Gandalf forgives him of this and says that perhaps there's no harm done, and in fact something good may have even come out of it. He's not excusing it. He's showing mercy. So Tolkien shows this repeatedly in the Lord of the Rings. The way in which mercy underpins justice. So he does justice, and these characters are perceived as good and just for doing the merciful thing. No? I think it's the case anyway. Let's go to the third of the four cardinal virtues, namely courage. And I said that courage in Tolkien's portrait includes the classical understanding of courage. But it expresses itself most characteristically and distinctly in a Christian way. It is expressed in patient, long-suffering endurance. Which Paul talks about in his letters as well. Because patience produces character, and character produces hope, and hope is not disappointed. So there's why? Because in hope one is dependent on a force of good beyond oneself. This is a great way of illustrating it. If prudence and justice are virtues of the mind and spirit, courage and temperance are bodily virtues. So the first two we looked at were mental or spiritual virtues. Prudence and justice. Courage and temperance are bodily types of virtues. Chesterton says that courage is almost a contradiction in terms it's a strong desire to live taking the form of a readiness to die. Courage is the strong desire to live taking the form of a readiness to die. It is good and beautiful to die for one's fatherland. It's the Roman proverb that Lewis quotes. We want to live, we want to preserve life, and so we're willing to die. There's greater evil than death. It is life without honor, and it's a life without virtue. That's worse than death. Rather die than give in to that sort of life. Lots of calls for for courage in Scripture. Lots of calls for Scripture courage in the Lord of the Rings. We see it in the assembling of the host of Aragorn before the Black Gate at the end. This is a terrific act of courage because they know that they can't win. They go out, however, not to throw their lives away, but in hope that somehow, by going out and fighting, others may bring down Sauron, and chiefly in that case, Frodo and Sam. But there's a terrific courage in that because they may well lose their lives in the process. Remember the speech of Aragorn in the face of that. He's so hopeful, he says, that one day the world of men will come crashing down and ruin, but it's not this day. This is terrific hopefulness. There's no reason for him to think this, by the way, on the basis of what's in front of him. There's no basis for him to think that we're not going to lose this day. Well, you look at their enemies, they're totally surrounding them. Well, I think it is this day. It's the world of men's coming down to ruin. There's no basis for him making such a statement other than his hope, which has been fostered by his courage. And his courage is a sort of long-suffering hope in some power beyond himself. In this case, his faithfulness to his friends and his trust that they will remain faithful to their quest to the end. So there's an element of trust that's a part of this as well. And even putting oneself into the debt of others that are greater than he. So at the final battle at the Black Gate, Gandalf calls for this type of courage. He says, "Prudence would counsel you to strengthen such strong places as you have, and there await the onset." So where our foe is greater, far stronger, let's stick in the strongholds, behind the walls, because we'll hold out much longer. And then he says, "I do not counsel prudence. I said victory could not be achieved by arms. I still hope for victory, but not by arms," says Gandalf. So it's a strange sort of courage. It's a courage dependent not on, even though it's a physical thing, it's not trusting in our physical strength. So it's a spiritual manifestation. And the purpose of this is, he lays out quite clearly. He says, we must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength so that he will empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. He will take that bait. Note that there's a sense of compulsion, a moral obligation. We must do this. That repetition of must. And he will take that bait. Why? Because he sees with one eye. We talked about that a few classes ago. He will take that bait in hope and in greed. Again, the reference to greed that I just talked about. For he will think that in such rashness he sees the pride of the new ring lord. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage, but with small hope for ourselves. But this, I deem, is our duty, and better so than to perish nonetheless, as we surely shall if we sit here, and know as we die that no age shall be. So they're going to be courageous to the end. They have to do it. And why do they do it? For the sake of life. Because if they sit there behind, they're going to die anyway. Let's go out and do it for the sake of future generations so that other ages may be. So they're to be effectively sacrificial lambs. That's the call. I think it's Bonhoeffer that says when Christ calls a man, he bids him come to die. Sheep to the slaughter. So they are to be courageous in this sense. And Gandalf, by the way, even Gandalf is afraid of Sauron. It's not that he's not afraid, he is afraid. Actually, that's sort of well done in The Lord of the Rings a little bit, although I thought it was overdone. When the chief of the ring wraiths comes into the city and knocks Gandalf down and blows apart his staff, and the terror in Gandalf's face, I think that's appropriate. There's a fear. It's the chief, by the way, it's the chief weapon of the enemy as well. That's also worth noting, is that it's the attack on the virtues that is the chief weapon of the enemy. So it's the privation of the virtue which manifests itself in fearfulness. And that's what the ring wraiths do. They cry from the height, and everyone cowers in fear. And they throw down their weapons. They're not willing to fight. Denethor throws himself onto the funeral pyre, or throws himself, having done so, then throws himself off the wall of the city, dies, perishes, out of what? Fear. He's supposed to be the steward of Gondor, to hold the fort to the end. He instead gives in to fear, and he consumes himself. Joseph Pieper, in this book that I referred to, and so does Ralph Wood, the four Cardinal Virtues, says this about courage and its connection with wisdom. He says, if in this supreme test, in face of which the braggart falls silent and every heroic gesture is paralyzed, a man walks straight up to the cause of his fear and is not deterred from doing that which is good. If, moreover, he does so for the sake of good, which ultimately means for the sake of God, and therefore not from ambition or from fear of being taken for a coward, this man, and he alone, is truly brave. So the man who faces up his fears for the sake of the good, which means for the sake of God, because God is good. That is brave. By the way, Éowyn is not brave. At least Tolkien doesn't suggest that she is. It may seem like she is. She's trying to throw her life away. She wants to die. There's a darkness, a shadow that's set itself on her heart, and she goes out to fight because she wants to get killed. She wants to die. Mary notes that she does not fight because she's convinced of the rightness of her cause and the prospect of its ultimate victory. She's infuriated that she's been denied her rightful role as a warrior because she's a woman. And he notes that she has the face of one that goes seeking death, having no hope. This is not courage. Note that she has to spend time in the healing houses to have her virtue restored to her. So even there, so Éowyn is also a good illustration of how God overrules even the characters that we will see as the good characters, even when the good characters give in to evil, as Frodo does, as Éowyn does. Éowyn gives in to evil, by the way. She doesn't pursue good. She gives in to evil, and God nonetheless intervenes and saves her out of that, just as he saves Frodo and the whole company. They in the end, they give in to evil, and they don't do it for the sake of the good. They're not courageous, and yet they are blessed for it nonetheless. This is the mercy that is shown, and it's the fulfillment of a sort of justice. Because remember, Éowyn had lost her loved ones, been bereft of it. She was despairing. She wasn't going to earn her salvation. It was going to be given to her. So, although it's heroic on the one side, Tolkien suggests that it's more of an embittered fearlessness, which is foolhardiness. Throwing your life away at a pin's drop is not courage. It's foolhardiness. Aristotle will condemn it even. The early Christian martyrs were forbidden, although martyrdom was one of the marks of the saints. for which you would be praised. It was forbidden in the early church to throw your life away recklessly. That was not following God. If your life is taken from you, that's one thing, but do not seek to lose your life. By putting yourself in a situation where it's going to be taken from you, or inviting it, go ahead and kill me. That's a suicide bomber. That's not a martyr. A martyr has hope. A suicide bomber has despair and hatred. Right? The motivation is absolutely key. Similarly, Sam Gamgee learns the difference between just a fearlessness without any cause and true courage when he finds Frodo lying dead. Or at least he assumes Frodo's lying dead. What does he do? He has a debate. He could do three things. What's the debate? He could take the ring and carry it to Mount Doom alone. He could pursue Gollum and kill him to avenge his master. Or he could join Frodo in death by taking his own life. He actually contemplates that. I said I'd take my master, go with my master to the end. He's just died. I'll take my life too. I'll die by his side. Shall I take the ring and go after that Gollum, that miserable Gollum? Shall I take my own life here, or shall I take the ring and carry it to Mount Doom as I swore to do? And he looked on the bright point of the sword. He thought of the places behind where there was a black brink and an empty fall into nothingness. If he takes his own life, it is a sort of a courage, but actually it's also an act of cowardice because he's avoiding the thing that he ought to do for the good. So on the one side it seems courageous and loyal. On the other hand, he's avoiding a bigger fear. And yet remember, he was part of the company. He was sworn to the quest, and he gave his word. They would all do it if they will to do it. If he wills not to do it at that point, then the quest fails. It's all on Sam at that point. He decides that he will carry the ring, and Sam says that certainly the ring had grown greatly in power as it approached the places of its forging, but one thing it did not confer, and that was courage. So it doesn't give him any greater courage to carry the ring. So there's no moral virtue the ring of power does not enhance moral virtue. That's interesting. It enhances power, but it does not confer goodness. On the contrary, its power grows as it preys on goodness. And in the end, it is the most courageous act is endurance to the end, bearing one's cross. That's what the Hobbits chiefly represent, but all the heroes of Middle-earth do. They're going to see it through to the end. There's a sort of a grim determination which marks the Hobbits, which I think Tolkien and Lewis present in all their works as a virtuous conduct. So think back to Lewis's portrait in the sci-fi novels. Ransom, in the end, realizes that he's just got to obey. He's got to grit. He has to grit his teeth and do the right thing, even though if he doesn't see the outcome, he's still going to do that. And Frodo, at one point, when they're in within the walls of Mount Doom, ascending up, he says, "This is futile. We're almost certainly going to fail." But Frodo says, "Still, we shall have to try. It's no worse than I expected. I never hoped to get across. I can't see any hope of it now, but I've still got to do the best I can." So even when they've lost hope, there's a hope beyond the hope and a commitment to it. And that is part of a courage. It's a moral courage. He's given his word. Sam says the same thing. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. I intend to keep it. Key. So a fidelity, a truthfulness, or even a troth faithfulness, if you want to present it in the medieval type terms. He's given his word. There's a fidelity, a love of his master. And he's given his word, and his word is his bond. He's wedded to his master in some ways through that oath that he's given, and to the others for that matter. Comments or questions? We got 2 minutes here. I'll come to Temperance as the last one. Yes?
Earlier when you said you have to combat the external power of the ring by force, you were going to at least battle one manifestation of evil that would destroy you. I thought of the quote from Edmund Burke: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."
Yes. Now he conceives that externally, right? Evil forces, evil man, evil, right.
Would you describe that to be Faramir's modus operandi then?
No, well, yes and no. He recognizes that there's a greater threat to evil, or an equal threat to evil within himself as well as outside himself. So that's the difference between Boromir and Faramir. Boromir conceives of evil only as an external thing to be fought. He's a sort of, in fact, he's a Manichaean effectively, right? We're the good, they're the bad. And there's no threat to evil for me as long as I fight the evil. It's out there. Faramir recognizes the depravity of his own heart as well as the depravity of other people's hearts. He has to fight, he has to defend, but note that he doesn't think of it as fighting the evil, he thinks it as defending the good. But the good is not him. It's part of him, but it's everything that he's fighting for. It's Gondor and its heritage and all that. But the motivation is important there, and a recognition of how pernicious and widespread evil is there in Faramir's eyes, which is why he's wise, and not in Boromir's eyes. But he most certainly sees the necessity of fighting, and he's willing to fight. He just thinks that's not the only battle. The bigger battle is in resisting evil and clinging to the good, which is why he won't pick up the ring even if he found it on the road. He said, I won't pick it up. Because he realizes the greatest threat wouldn't be Sauron, it would be his own temptation to do evil. So there's an internal fight, which we all recognize with sin ourselves. Everyone in this room is a sinner. I could resist your evil, but then I'd have the problem of my own evil. That's a bigger problem. I can never get away from that one, because it goes around with me. We suffer from one another's sins, but we also suffer from our sinful disposition, our love of sin, for which we need to be forgiven, and for which we need to go on a path of avoiding it wherever we can and promoting the good, and that's the best way, by the way. So I have been outspoken in public on my view of the way evil manifests itself. By the way, I'll talk about it tonight when we talk about human rights legislation at 7 o'clock. That evil needs to be combated and seen for what it is, identified and fought. But ultimately, my vocation as a teacher is to promote the good and the beautiful and the true. And that is the best way to fight evil, is not to use, to see evil as so all-encompassing that there is no goodness. That just, therein lies despair. Christians historically have resisted evil. They've called out slavery, they've called out abortion, they've called out murder, they've called out all manner of exploitation, but they've also created educational institutions, universities, hospitals, social welfare agencies to promote the good. And that's distinctly Christian, right? Because you do it for others. Education isn't for my purposes. I mean, I may get a salary from it, but it's for your purposes. And a doctor works to heal the sick, not to get a paycheck. And people that work for a paycheck, we call bad doctors and bad teachers. If that's their motivation, I mean, they have to get paid because they couldn't do it without being paid, but is that why they do it? Or to get socially, get social affirmation? Everyone thinks, oh, wow, you're a doctor. Trust me, if you're a Christian teaching literature, people don't think that you're particularly wonderful. You teach poetry? Amongst Christians, what? You don't teach theology? What's the point of that then? Like seriously, when I tell people I teach at Tyndale, they say, oh, you teach theology. No, I teach English literature. They say, oh, okay. That's it.